Good afternoon. Thanks for having me. I'm delighted to be invited to give a final input and would like to thank the speakers for presenting their interesting insights into their work. And as a member of ALDA's Scientific Advisory Board, I was familiar with some of the projects, but also heard a lot of new things and can now conclude with an outlook. So, in recent years, I've analyzed several instruments of participatory democracy and governance, especially on the topic of climate change. So, here you see a list of the evaluation reports and research articles I had contributed to that might be of interest for you. For example, I did the evaluation of the Austrian Climate Assembly, which Lukas Hammer has already presented to us. And I would also like to mention the Citizens Council on Climate Future in Vorarlberg. That's an instrument of participatory democracy from Austria's westernmost state, where the longest and I think most productive experience with this form of citizens' participation is running since 2006, so almost 20 years of hands-on experience. And last year, I conducted research in Hungary, mostly in Budapest and Debrecen, and to analyze the extent to which citizens' participation at the local level is or can be used in opposition or even resistance to national politics when it comes to environmental but also democratic resilience. So, for my statement now, I highlight three perspectives that have proven to be relevant both in my research and in my practical work as an advisor. And the number one is about socioeconomic needs and democracy, better known as "no one left behind," the catchphrase of the European Union's Green New Deal, also know it as a just transition. And although the framework is European, the day-to-day experience of people is very local. And there, at the local governance level, governance has an important duty. The climate crisis harbors social dynamite regarding the ecological transformation within a very short time horizon, and it requires the coordination of several governance levels across states and even across time, meaning across election days. So, as a result, democracies all over Europe are confronted with developments that threaten to undermine democracy, undermine not only their ability to govern, but also their ability to represent. And there's a loss of trust and satisfaction that ultimately jeopardizes democracy itself. And we know from research that hardly anyone is against climate protection per se, but that the numerous protesters, think of the Yellow Vests in France, or think of the farmers' protests in Germany last year. So these protesters feel that the outcomes of environmental policy are unfairly distributed. And our general distributive injustice is manifested in the big political issues of today. And the socioeconomic status, that's the formal education, that's income, that's wealth in general, this status relates not only with how much we are affected personally by an environmental crisis or any crisis at all, but also relates with the amount and intensity of participation and thus with political influence, and whether our political wishes are being heard or being largely ignored. And there's a trend all over Europe towards a so-called two-thirds democracy. The upper and middle class people are well integrated and able to make themselves heard, and politics responds to them. But the lower income third is increasingly refraining from political participation, and therefore they are less represented with their political concerns. So social inequality translates into political inequality, and this in turn represents a major reason for the declining trust in and legitimacy of political institutions. And responding to socioeconomic needs and introducing democratic innovation that answer this imbalance is where the survival of democracy is decided. So democracy begins at the local level, there we can become politically active quite easily. And our research shows while the trust in national politics or even European Union politics is comparatively low, local politicians enjoy a much higher level of trust. And if we address resilience building by reconciling ecological and social issues, we can show that climate protection is also a protection of democracy. And this brings me to the second point I would like to stress, and that's about the institutionalization of citizens' participation. We must answer this social imbalance of participation, and democratic innovations are part of the solution. Among them, most prominently, are citizens' assemblies working by sortition, by issuing a special invitation to those that are not already active citizens themselves. And speaking of environmental resilience, most prominent in recent years were climate assemblies. We have empirical evidence that the deliberation in mini publics promotes a public spirit and supports concerns for future generations. And in addition, and I like that very much, these are also instruments of social learning. And their goal is to achieve a social mandate for an ambitious policy. And one of my main findings in the evaluations I was commissioned with was participatory democracy is most efficient when it's not a one-off event. We need to work on establishing these procedures as part of the political system. So participatory democracy should not be lighthouse projects with which a politician makes a name for him or herself, but we need them as an integral part of democracy, just like elections are. So we need, for example, citizens' assemblies or participatory budgeting assemblies taking place at regular intervals so that they become routine for all those involved, meaning politicians, administration, and citizens. And we need them at every level, but most importantly at the local level, where people can experience their impact on politics most directly. So this institutionalization of local participatory democracy is even more important in view of the challenges we face at the national level. And these instruments must not just be political commitments made by some progressive politicians, because if the political winds change and other, even authoritarian parties find majorities, these instruments may not be continued. So it is therefore important to integrate them into the local and regional constitution. This was already done so in the region of Vorarlberg, in the city of Paris. Just think of eastern Belgium, also the German state of Baden-Württemberg, where I was advising. And there they now have the so-called dialogue-based Public Participation Act that provides a legal basis for organizing public participation with randomly selected citizens. And we need these instruments to be incorporated in the institutions because we need constant practice. So we need like steady climate assemblies like we have in Brussels or in Milano. And we need local and regional fairy lights instead of just one lighthouse. And they have to have an impact. People need to feel the change that comes with participation. Nothing is more frustrating than what the German urban planner Klaus Selle once called particitainment. And this brings me to the last point I want to make. So we have to bear in mind that the sheer increase in participation opportunities does not necessarily go hand in hand with more democracy. There is also what I could call citizens washing, participatory governance without democracy. So we must reflect on this challenge that instruments of participation can be exploited, can be used to pretend advancing democracy. So assessing the political challenges we are experiencing, especially right-wing populism and so on, we must be aware that an instrument of participation is first and foremost just a vessel, a means of political governance, and it can be used for democratic as well as for autocratic purposes. So just have a look at all the calls for more direct democracy issued mostly by politicians on the far right. They hope for what I call an imperative mandate from the so-called will of the people, and their referenda serve just an instrument of acclamation. I always think of the Austrian Freedom Party's leader. He announced long before winning the election that he wanted to govern by means of consultations, just as his friend Viktor Orban has already demonstrated in Hungary. So on this peculiar topic, I recommend a research article by my Hungarian colleagues Daniel Oros and Paul Tapp. And they show that this use, or rather misuse, of direct democracy works as a permanent election campaign. And the political system is not democratized, but charged with populism. But part of a resilient community is to set up instruments that are non-populist, that foster deliberation instead of polarization, as it is done with steady climate assemblies. Just look at Milano again. But also direct democracy would serve the cause. Direct democracy is being discredited due to the populist appropriation I was speaking about. However, there's nothing to say against more direct democratic instruments per se, but they would have to be designed in a non-populist way. And there are promising ideas and experiments in this regard. Just look at my colleague Nenad Stojanovic, political scientist in Switzerland, who experimented with a non-populist direct democracy in the Swiss canton of Valais. And so he was organizing citizens' committees before going to the polls. And these committees are structurally based on the same principles as our citizens' assemblies. So for further details, I refer you to the project website of DemoScan, where you can see how this is done. Because I have to come to an end, and then I want to have a look at the European Union level. You remember that we had this so-called new push for European democracy. It has been a priority for the European Commission beginning in 2019. A lot has happened, but we need to demand more. We saw the conference on the future of Europe with 800 randomly drawn citizens, and based on this, now we have European citizens panels. Currently, there's one running on a new European budget, but there is more to be done. During the conference on the future of Europe, the citizens there, they made substantial recommendations, including transnational parties, but also Europe-wide referendums in exceptional cases on extremely important matters to all European citizens. And then these recommendations had to be dealt with in the institutions. The European Parliament was the most citizens-friendly one, even adopted a report for more participation, and it wants a structured participation mechanism composed of citizens to advise on European Union priorities for the years to come and provide input to the Commission's work plan. So this report suggests the increased use of citizens panels and even their institutionalization. But as always, Commission and Member States are more hesitant, and we are not there yet. So we still need a new push also from our side, lobbying for more democracy. So I conclude, as important as it is to realize participatory democracy at the European Union level, the most important and immediate level of action in people's day-to-day experience of politics is the local level. We need to take 3 steps that I have shown in my presentation, from building resilient communities to institutionalization, and also facing the misuse and counteracting on this. And I recently wrote a whole book on defending democracy, and they're updating the political system with democratic innovation is an integral part of my book. So there would be much more to say, but I end for now and hope we have some time for discussion. Thank you very much.